This took a bit longer than I was expecting, partially because this episode was originally going to be devoted to Last Word. The problem was, after dozens of hours playing, replaying, and experiencing just shy of 100% of the game, I realized it's not that I'm not passionate enough to review this normally, which was why I wanted to do an indie Shindig on it, but it was simply a cool concept executed mediocre overall, filled with exposition, and still charging $10. And if I wanted to play a game focused heavily around the verbal duels and negotiations, I'd probably just have saved another 10 and get Grifflins. Anyway, all of this had led to a change of plans and a change of script last second, so I decided to skip ahead to a game I had a bit later on the list, but one I'm more confident is worth covering. Battle Chef Brigade. This is a game that's a bit odd when it comes to the realms of describing it. It's a brawling type game where you'll go through different fields to slay multiple beasts, and rather than taking their body parts for trophies, you retrieve them as ingredients for dishes. As you see in this world, some of the world's deadliest warriors and assassins are often also its greatest chefs, and they use the parts of the killed monsters to create these elaborate meals. This is demonstrated in the gameplay through the puzzle section of the game from the cooking. Having the combat interwoven with these match 3 puzzles gives you a break in between working on these puzzles to go hunting. While going through this, many questions had began to sprout, the primary one being what had created this seemingly worldwide culture of this type of behavior, and the story explains it rather simply. Necessity. Monsters were a problem in the land of Fictusia for a long time, but the threat they had became was no more prevalent than in the last century. They would become hyper-aggressive, wiping out livestock and destroying farms. The result of this was starvation spreading around the world. Well, this couldn't stand, and thus King Heinrich and the royal chef Rubicon would develop a battle chef brigade, who would band together to slay monsters and make them into extravagant meals. The actions of the king and chef had brought the world from the brink of destruction to prosperity once again, and the taboo of eating monsters for their tainted meat had become a commonplace tradition across Fictusia. Now, every year, aspirants are encouraged to apply to the tournament in order to become a member of the brigade and clear the fields of monsters, and fill the stomachs of the people. In the current time, we get to experience the world through the lens of Mina Han, a girl out in the country who works with her family at a local restaurant. She aspires to fulfill a greater purpose as part of the brigade. She sneaks out of her home one day to go to the annual ceremony, and that is the Battle Chef Tournament. But as to not get too caught up in the story, the gameplay in this one is especially a bit peculiar, as you travel on a side-scrolling fighter-esque experience to go around and defeat monsters to get the ingredients. Once you take the ingredients back, you can get to the actual cooking, where you'll gain score by the amount of intensity of flavors, and you make the meal more powerful by combining 3 matching elements of the same level into one element a level higher, like dealing with bony food, where you can mix them together to make a special element that can match with anything, or don't bother with them and don't add those ingredients in, or even better, use a cutting board. There's also things that are added in later, like the toxic elements or the delicate ingredients, which result in certain consequences when they're stirred too many times, which makes you have to think critically on how you make a meal, while also having to confront them to avoid score reduction, raising the difficulty curve in a way other than giving you shorter deadlines and higher point requirements to win. They also added new tools like the aforementioned cutting board, that and other skills that add or modify specific aspects, make it easier to match elements, a slow cooker, which is my personal favorite, as it adds a whole new strategy for cooking 2 dishes at once, and at higher difficulties that's commonplace. Some strategies and ingredients complement others, and since you're limited to only 3 cooking stations and 3 special tools, a lot of thought has to be placed on what you're going to cook. Will I use a lot of sauce? I might want to use the sauce bonus book if I'm actually going to. Actually, this competition's main ingredient is Verskit, and I think I could use all the parts of one to make a good dish, so it's a good thing I brought in the book that gives me a bonus for using all parts. But practice doesn't start or end in these contests. There's a lot of this planning, meticulous thought that can go into the cooking minigames, and these jobs you do in between challenges and days serve as great in-between for you to not get overwhelmed, but to get a good level of practice in as you do these small jobs to get some more money for your upgrades. Also, doubling is a good incentive to practice in the first place. I could see this being annoying in replays, however. I could see the average player in a second playthrough doing just enough jobs to get the exact set they know they like. Fortunately, the competition part isn't just tied to a story mode. With daily challenges, leaderboards, free play, there are plenty of ways to hone your skills outside the story mode, and many ways you can explore different loadouts using different cooks. Some might think that there is a bit of an imbalance of complexity when it comes to the game's cooking and the game's combat, while others may have simply forgotten that there's a combat aspect to begin with. It's true, the combat's nothing to write home about. There's about a dozen enemies and a few different ways of approaching some of them, but honestly, yeah, you can get by button mashing. But there are certain conditions that have to be met to get certain ingredients. Some monsters have to be fed to spawn certain ingredients on death, and there's a couple of small tidbits like the wind fruit will only show up on the map when the wind is blowing. Almost all of these elements depend on waiting, and you don't necessarily have to stand there for it to happen, so it's more in the camp of exploration than combat, so yeah, combat is definitely the weak aspect of this game, and it does suffer from it. Fortunately, it suffers from it very little because the game is aware of this. 2 of the 3 jobs you run as Mina are focused on cooking. A lot of the bonuses you get for loadouts are for cooking, and just about every newly presented mechanic or plot point is focused on the cooking. All the better, as I prefer that the cooking is stronger than the combat. I can go to playing games for satisfying or good looking combat, and instead focusing on the cooking, the puzzles, the loadouts you've tied together to try to form a strategy is honestly a lot more engaging than the combat. While we're on the subject of the game's strengths, I think one of it has to be the game's cast. There's a lot of design in the NPCs to make them distinct. The game also really does take the time to show not only the variety and creativity in making food out of these monsters, but what types of food each chef would make is a reflection of the chef themselves. The game also, like in gameplay, likes to focus on the chef part of the Battle Chef Brigade. Thrash has a magical sword that speaks to him, but the game likes to focus on the story of a father of 2 who makes fantastic barbecue from experience feeding his kids. Ziggy is a necromancer with an army of skeletons, but he uses them to run a cafe, and he makes unhealthy, greasy food because, well, why would he care about clogged arteries?
Just because I get assistance from the undead doesn't mean I don't have standards. They wear gloves.
All in all, an entertaining title that likes to tease the brain and show creative designs of the culinary field in a fantasy-themed fashion. If that's something you're looking for and you wanted a more T-rated title from this list, this would be the go-to. It's weird to think this game was published by Adult Swim. Huh. Well, I think that's all there is to cover for this title. I hope you all have a good day and be safe.